University of British Columbia.
Thank you. Honourable Senators, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and speak to you about Bill C-45. As mentioned, I'm here from the University of British Columbia School of Nursing. My clinical and research expertise are in adolescent mental health and substance use, including co-leading with my colleague, Assistant Professor Rebecca Haynes-Saw out of University of Calgary, the Teens Report on Adolescent Cannabis Experiences, or TRACE, program of research. TRACE is Canada's longest-standing qualitative research program in youth cannabis use, which began with a focus on youth who use cannabis frequently. My research approach is participatory, and I strive to bring youth voices to the evidence base to generate solutions that are grounded in data and that resonate with the populations they are intended to serve. I believe in learning from youth expertise and in supporting youth to engage to their fullest capacity. As such, while I can and will incorporate elements of youth perspective in my testimony, I cannot speak on their behalf. I am pleased to know that you'll be hearing from a young person this afternoon and would encourage you to pursue additional opportunities to have youth meaningfully involved in this policy process. Today I will focus on a few key areas where available evidence can help inform this legislation as it pertains to youth. First, speaking to concerns regarding harms associated with cannabis use amongst youth. An important starting point for this discussion is to provide a bit of perspective by characterizing what we understand to be the magnitude of the problem. As I'm certain you have heard in other testimony, the prevalence of cannabis use amongst youth has remained stable or declined in recent years. Earlier this year, Statistics Canada estimated the prevalence of cannabis use amongst youth 15 to 17 years at 18% and amongst youth aged 18 to 24 at 28.4%. Though cannabis use amongst Canadian youth is high relative to their peers from other countries, the proportion of youth with problematic or high-risk use is small. Indeed, a recent study using Canadian population-based data found that approximately 2 to 2.5% of youth who use cannabis do so in ways that result in severe health or social consequences. This means that we anticipate approximately 0.4% of Canadian youth aged 15 to 17 and 0.6% aged 18 to 24 to be using cannabis in ways that will result in harms such as health, social, legal, or financial problems. Those who initiate early and who use frequently are most at risk, and young men are more at risk than young women for these harms, or experience greater risk. One of the most concerning of the potential health harms are the reported links between adolescent cannabis use and psychosis, particularly chronic or recurrent psychotic disorders. While research suggests that there is an association between adolescent cannabis use and psychosis, this area of research remains inconclusive. What we do know from the mental health field is that mental health and substance use disorders tend to result from the complex interplay between biological, psychological, and social factors as opposed to single risk factors alone. A youth participant from our TRACE studies nicely outlines the ambiguity of our evidence on cannabis that contributes to us being here today. Quote, "I thought doing research would kind of help us find the yeses and the nos, but actually it didn't. It made us more confused. But we did learn more of why it could be a yes or why it could be a no, so I think that's really valuable toward finding the conclusions," end quote. Indeed, ongoing research on cannabis is critical to minimizing the harms, and the legalization of cannabis will facilitate this. Having provided an estimate of the proportion of the youth population who we anticipate will experience cannabis-related harms, I will now discuss my second point, the social determinants of health and social inequities caused by current cannabis policy. Under the current regulatory framework, cannabis use is dealt with through criminalization and based not in evidence for harms, but rather on an outdated, punishment-focused paradigm framed around ideology and moral disapproval of drugs. While we lack good data on the full spectrum of costs associated with this approach, cannabis-related enforcement measures alone are estimated at $1.2 billion annually. Additionally, there is strong evidence that the social costs of criminalization are profound and disproportionately affect youth, particularly Indigenous and racialized youth and youth in marginalized communities. These harms include stigmatization and exclusion, limited opportunities for meaningful employment, worsening levels of poverty and poorer health outcomes, all while exhausting limited public resources. The Cannabis Act will create a new legal and regulatory framework that is grounded in a public health approach, with the potential to target and respond to these inequities and to generate revenue that can be directed towards intervention across the full spectrum of need, from education and prevention efforts for all youth, as well as the treatment needs of the small proportion of youth requiring this type of specialized care. To end on a positive and optimistic note, my third and final point is to offer a strengths-based perspective to the dialogue on youth and cannabis use. Current concerns about the impact of legalization on youth cannabis use tend to frame this issue from a deficit-based perspective. There is great emphasis on the need to protect youth, and while this is indeed important, it fails to adequately account for the significant capacity that young people possess and the role that our policies and society ought to play in equipping young people with the skills and resources to navigate cannabis use decision-making in a way that is informed and grounded in best available evidence. From our TRACE program of youth-engaged research, we have demonstrated that with the right tools, education, and support, young people can undertake complex analyses of evidence and draw informed conclusions about the risks and harms of cannabis use and strategies for minimizing these. This research also indicates that the current approach to prevention and education is ineffective. Much of this results from messaging that is fear-based and exaggerates risk, which potentially leads to other harms. As one of our youth participants has explained, quote, "They make weed sound so bad, and then when people find out that weed's not that bad, they think all drugs are not that bad. So then they go out into the drug thing and they think all drugs won't change them, but those other drugs change you," end quote. But it also is the product of a confusing policy landscape, one in which cannabis is technically illegal, but in which the prevalence of use is high, access to cannabis easy, and conflicting information and messaging commonplace. In fact, our film-based education resource, Cycles, created for use in school settings, came about due to feedback from teachers that they felt ill-equipped to talk to youth about cannabis use. In part because of the legal gray zone in which it sits. Legalization and regulation will provide a more well-defined context from which evidence-based, open and honest prevention and education interventions can be implemented. This process should be done in partnership with youth and should include harm reduction principles so as to be inclusive of the needs of both those who use and do not use cannabis. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much.